Yes, very good morning to you. It is Friday, the 16th of October, 2020. Welcome back to the best On Ground Weekday Kickoff. My name's Pete Fairbairn, and as always, I'm joined by one of, well, usually we say the country's preeminent sports journos, but today we're going to go across the ditch to the Irishman who lives in New Zealand, who has written about Australian rugby for a long time, but about rugby all over the world as well. Paul Cully joins me from stuff.co.nz. How are you, Paul?
Good, mate. How are you?
Very, very well. Fantastic to have you back on the show. You made such an impression last time, and ahead of a huge second Bledisloe Cup match at Eden Park this coming Sunday on the back of a draw in the first Bledisloe match. It's fantastic timing, and we are going to start with rugby union today with a couple of stories there. We will get to the Bledisloe Cup, but firstly we're going to start with a story from Sammy Phillips in the Sydney Morning Herald. And it appears as if South Africa will not be coming down under to play in the Rugby Championship, according to that yarn. Ultimately, the 6-week tournament is now going to be cut in half in terms of the fact it was going to feature 12 matches in total. South Africa's shock withdrawal comes hours after SANZAAR tabled a revised Rugby Championship model, which would have appeased the Springboks' request to play 500 minutes of Super Rugby unlocked before boarding a flight to Australia. Ultimately, I think the Springboks high performance staff are concerned about player welfare. They're concerned about putting their players in a position to play test matches when they're not prepared. Flip side of that, of course, is that the Argentinian team, who have been in Australia for a while already, well, a lot of them haven't played any rugby at all since Super Rugby was shut down in April, or in March even. So, disappointing result for the tournament. Disappointing. It'll have flow-on effects from a financial perspective. The flip side, I guess, being that credit should be paid to South Africa for putting in their eyes putting welfare ahead of money here, and trying to think about their players' interests first. What are the broader ramifications, Paul, for the Rugby Championship on the back of this announcement, and what does it mean in regards to South Africa's long-term involvement with SANZAAR? Because we know they're not going to be involved in Super Rugby moving forward. Do you think that this signals the beginning of the end for them in terms of the Rugby Championship as well?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think that's the question this morning. It's not so much about this Rugby Championship. Everybody knew there were complications there. But listen, the last time I spoke to SANZAAR CEO Andy Marinos, he told me that part of his job was fighting for the future of the SANZAAR alliance. So that was an acknowledgement from him that things were looking ropey. There is a fair bit of mail around that South Africans were very unhappy at New Zealand pulling out of Super Rugby, and they may even see that as a breach of contract. I don't think that they felt they owed New Zealand anything. If you look at what's happened over the last last month or so, South Africa have watched Australia and New Zealand go to war over the scheduling of the Rugby Championship. And on the eve of that Rugby Championship, say, we're not going to take part anymore. I think SANZAAR is clearly at its most difficult point in its relationship in 25 years. They're going to play in the Pro 14. I don't see how they can stay in the Rugby Championship longer term. Doesn't make any sense to me.
Is there a sense of irony that Australian rugby, probably for a few years now, has been pretty open to a Super Rugby future without South Africa, and it's been New Zealand rugby that's been insistent on retaining South Africa in that competition, predominantly from a performance perspective and speaking to the fact that they needed the competition of playing against South Africa. Yet the way in which New Zealand rugby has conducted themselves in their exit from Super Rugby, it's not necessarily the decision itself, but the actual way in which it was announced and reached that has really blindsided and upset South Africa.
That's spot on, Pete. As you say, it's not the decision itself. I mean, that's in many ways the Trans-Tasman arrangement is an optimal one for rugby down here anyway. It's the way that they did it. And what confused me about it is that when New Zealand came out and said, right, we're planning for a future without South Africa, I had assumed, incorrectly as it turned out, that they had been having conversations with South Africa and let them know, before we go public, let's get it all lined up. We all know where we stand. So then when we do it, there's not going to be any fallout. Now, that is the typical way of New Zealand working. They've done that over many years, been very effective about doing it that way. This time, they've done it the opposite way, and it's caused huge ramifications, hasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And from looking at this through an Australian lens again, it was reported in the Australian Financial Review yesterday that broadcast negotiations continue to ramp up for Rugby Australia, and speculation that Nine Media, are making a play and potentially looking to put Super Rugby not only on free to air but also through their streaming service Stan. Fox Sports, the other main rival or the only other competitor for those rights. From a broadcast perspective, where does Fox Sports stand with this year's competition now? Will they be paying less money to the competing nations? New Zealand Rugby and Australian Rugby going to be shortchanged by this as well?
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about millions of dollars here. And what does Rugby Australia need at the moment? It needs cash, and it needs it quickly. Let's not kid ourselves about where Rugby Australia still is. It was marginal earlier in the year. It is slashed cost, I believe, by about 50%. And these are really, really difficult times. I know within Rugby Australia at the very top, there is a determination and belief that they're going to fight their ways through this. But, they're under no illusions about how difficult this is financially and how much of a blow this is going to be. Plus, it prevents them from selling a good news story.
And you look at the displeasure Hamish McLennan, the Rugby Australia chairman, has had with the way New Zealand Rugby has operated over the last few months, and he's been fairly consistent in and open in speaking about the relationship between Australia and New Zealand being at its lowest ebb, and this decision by South Africa, partially, it appears caused by the disrespect of New Zealand Rugby, certainly won't help that relationship. Look, let's turn to action on the field, because we had a fantastic first Bledisloe Cup match. And now we'll move to the second match this week. It's at a venue Australia hasn't won at in 36 years. We know that cumulatively the All Blacks have averaged over 40 points a match against the Wallabies at Eden Park the last 5 times they played there. The Wallabies not anywhere near that many points. So it's a huge challenge, but there's some injury disruptions for the All Blacks, and I'll get you to fill me in on that. And in general, as we look at an article here from Wayne Smith in The Australian, that he's got Phil Kearns speaking about Jordan Patea and Hunter Paisami and whether Patea should come into the starting lineup if he is fit, and also has some quotes from Jeff Parling around the line out and around I guess whether there's any need for rugby or for the Wallabies to be looking at the way that they're approaching the breakdown and the way in which their forward pack is operating. What do you expect to see at the selection table from both teams later this morning?
Well, I'll get the All Blacks out of the way first. I think the big one for them is Sam Whitelock. Took a head knock last week and would have to be in serious doubt. I suspect what they will do there is bring Scott Barrett in straight away. Hasn't played in 3, 4, 5 months, whatever it is, a long period of time. But I think they'll bring him straight back in. He's very naturally fit. I think Beauden Barrett will play. It's my understanding that Josh Ioane will be named for Otago later tonight for their game in the Mitre 10 Cup on Sunday, which indicates Barrett's fine to go. Australia-wise, the big problem last week was a line out. I know Jeff Parling sort of contested that, but when you lose throws or you get messy ball, you reduce your ability to attack Richie Mo'unga on defence, which I think was part of the plan. I think they'll change it up at hooker. I think Falafenga hasn't been playing well for a while now. Jordy Patea is going to be a world-class player, but he's had a run of injuries. I think Hunter Paisami did enough last week to keep his place. Breakdown is just a collective thing. Rennie will be drilling into them all week, get there quicker and move bodies. So I don't expect to see too many changes, but there will be changes.
There's been a bit of speculation that the Wallabies may move to a 6-2 on the bench, and whether Noah Lolesio could drop off for an extra forward, or whether they do stay with the 5-3 and keep Reece Hodge, maybe included Patea, as well as Jake Gordon. Which way would you be going?
Look, I would do anything to get Patea in the team. That would be my number one concern, to find room for him in the 23, because he can change a game. The kid's going to be a superstar. But look, we know where the All Blacks are going to come this week. It's going to be up front. It's going to be a brutal examination of the Wallabies pack. So perhaps there's room for Liam Wright to come onto that bench as well. We know he operates well at the line out, hits a lot of rucks, in good form. So he's a good player, a good option too.
Let's move to another sport now, and we'll move to the AFL. But when I was reading this article from Michael Warner in the Herald Sun, I almost thought I was on BBC Sport reading about the English Premier League, because it's almost blow for blow, exactly the same scenario. And that's, the suggestion that 5 of the AFL's richest clubs have held talks amid fears that they could be forced to shoulder the burden of the industry's mega cost cuts. Collingwood, West Coast, Richmond, Hawthorn and Essendon have formed a loose coalition ahead of a proposed post-COVID reshaping of the AFL's equalisation system. The 5 clubs want the AFL to guarantee annual distributions for all clubs equivalent to the full salary cap next year and beyond, and not just to the competition's cash-strapped teams, as has been the position over the last decade. We've seen in the English Premier League this week, of course, there was the Project Restart, which crashed and burned pretty quickly. It was essentially driven by the power struggle between the big 6 clubs in the Premier League and the other clubs. Looks like something pretty similar at play here in the AFL, with the rich trying to ensure that they retain that status, rather than necessarily being focused on the other clubs in the competition and their ability to just keep ticking over. Does disunity amongst the ranks of AFL clubs spell serious trouble for that competition, Paul?
Yes, it does. But it's like politics, man. Disunity is death, especially in a competition like the AFL, who, even if you don't love the sport, what you have to admire about the AFL is the amount of centralised control they've managed to exert over their clubs for a number of years. And look what's flowed from that. Truly national competition, huge amount of success commercially. I think they will want to stamp down pretty hard on this. They're an extremely well-run organisation, the AFL. I can understand why the big clubs want a little bit more money, but where does it end once you open this Pandora's box?
Yeah, some interesting comments in the article. Hawthorn President Jeff Kennett, of course, former Victorian Premier, talked about that. These types of meetings, everything should stay behind closed doors. You should be able to speak freely and know that those conversations will remain confidential. You look at the fact that details of this story emerged on a show which is produced by Collingwood President Eddie Maguire's network and his links there. And even speculation in that story that Sydney Swans President Andrew Pridham had possibly made a suggestion that maybe the AFL couldn't continue with 18 clubs as well, which is a fascinating subplot as well. We'll continue to watch that with interest, but I dare say the AFL Commission and CEO Gil McLachlan wouldn't be thrilled with that narrative coming out on the eve of preliminary finals this week. Speaking of preliminary finals, we will turn to action on the field in the NRL, and there's almost a resignation to the fact that tonight will be Cameron Smith's either penultimate NRL appearance or final one, depending on whether the Storm are able to get the job done against the Canberra Raiders at Suncorp Stadium. It's been a saga of epic proportion, the willy won't-he situation around the man that many would say is the greatest player in that game's history. He's 37 years old. He's played over 420 matches for the Storm, a one-club man, which is pretty remarkable. He's still playing great football. This is what, he doesn't appear to be a guy who's on the decline, but the Melbourne Storm organisation also have a youngster by the name of Harry Grant on their books who they're really keen to keep and really keen to give him an opportunity to play. As we head into this match tonight, which Brent Reid in the Australian tells us will almost certainly be Smith's final match at Suncorp Stadium, do you think the competition and the NRL and community in general take Cameron Smith for granted? Do you think he receives the credit he deserves for what's been a phenomenal career, or do you think a man who has not always had universal admirers and he's been a bit gruff. There's been a lot of criticism that he hasn't made his intentions clear beyond this year? Do you think he's taken for granted, perhaps?
I don't think he's been taken for granted, but it'll be one of those cases that when he goes, people will realise how good he is. Like I moved to Australia in 2000. For the last 2 decades, watching league, there's 2 players who stood out. One's Andrew Johns, one's Cam Smith. To me, those 2 guys are out on their own. Everybody else is beneath them. And when you include players like Cooper Cronk, we're talking about not being at that level. That gives you an indication of how good Cam Smith is. His ability to read the play, when to kick, when to pass, use that left foot of his. I mean, he almost transcends league. He's that good. He always has so much time on the ball, and he's as tough as they come as well. I mean, a lot of the stuff about him having his critics, that's just the noise of rugby league. When it's all said and done, when Cam Smith has got his feet up watching the game and people are looking back at his career, he'll be recognised for what he is, and an absolutely special, exceptional player. He's played so many games. I mean, what can you say about him? He's right up there for me.
He makes other players so much better in that time seems to stand still a little bit when he's on the ball, and because he plays in a different position to, say, an Andrew Johns, you don't necessarily see him cut the opposition to shreds in the same fashion, but it just makes everyone around him better, doesn't he?
He does, and what he does, man, is that he puts pressure on other teams in lots of ways. But the way that he does that mainly is through his kicking game, and when he chooses to kick, has been a weapon of his for a long time. I know rugby league don't like to talk about kicking. I think that's a rugby thing, but the way he uses is to put the vice on teams is, exceptional. And his ability to read the game in real time, amazing.
Our final story today, we're going to turn to cricket, and we're going to turn to an article from John Perrick and Andrew Wu in the Sydney Morning Herald, and it looks at the fact that Cricket Australia are preparing to splash the cash on international stars to add box office appeal to the Big Bash League, as it emerged that the sports governing body has also taken a key step in its broadcast rights fight. In a move that will address Channel 7's concerns over the quality of the Big Bash, foreign players could be offered more than $140,000 to take part in the 8-week tournament. Cricket Australia has offered up a list of names it feels can complete an independent valuation of the broadcast rights as well, which would hopefully help to ease some of the constant fighting that we've seen between the broadcaster Channel 7 and Cricket Australia, that is heading to an independent tribunal where essentially Channel 7 is asking that tribunal to rule on what are the value of the rights and what should we be paying. The Big Bash League's been at the heart of this conflict. Channel 7 disappointed that the big names, whether they are Australian test and one-day cricketers or whether they're international stars, haven't been able to be secured for this competition. And with that in mind, they think that the competition isn't valued at what they paid for it when they first signed that deal a couple of years ago. It's an incredibly messy situation, Paul. Is it one of the messiest you've seen in sport? And do you think there's light at the end of the tunnel, I guess, for Cricket Australia?
Possibly, but I think what it shows is how broadcasters are now much more prepared to fight for what they see as value. And I don't think it's going to be the last of these situations, because what it is effectively saying is that if it used to be the case where broadcasters would pay for the rights and let the organisation run the competition, what Channel 7 is saying, on the back of some pretty tough negotiations by Nine as well around the rugby league and getting a reduction, is that they now see themselves as equal partners in an entertainment project. Let's call it Big Bash, but it could be any competition, and they want to say what that looks like. And it's this year has emboldened the broadcasters, into taking this stance, and you really can't blame them.
The trajectory of broadcast rights valuations, I mean, we've seen it grow and grow over the past decade, but long before COVID, there was a suggestion that the bubble would burst and that it wasn't sustainable. I heard a comment on the Sounding Board podcast this week where Craig Hutchison was asked, what do you think the cricket broadcast rights are worth? And he said they're worth what a broadcaster is willing to pay for them, and not $1 more. You know, ultimately the power does rest with the broadcaster. And we could speak about the Big Bash and the challenges for that competition in general over recent years, with probably an introduction of too many games and an inability to get the biggest stars in the world to come down under and commit to a competition that runs for so long. But ultimately, Paul, Channel 7 probably do hold most of the cards here, don't they?
Yeah, they absolutely do. I mean, this year has been an enormous wake-up call for rights holders all around the world. And it's the phrase this year has been used a lot. It's the new normal, isn't it? And I do not have a problem with the aggressive approach that broadcasters have taken this year. I think some ways in years gone by, they've been a little bit too passive and allowed organisations to make bad decisions, which has hurt the value of the competitions that they're broadcasting.
Yeah, in many ways, who would have thought we'd say this, but maybe the fact that Rugby Australia is in negotiations for a new broadcast deal that comes in as part of this new normal, new era, could actually be beneficial for that code, and whoever they manage to partner with us, they'll go in with their eyes wide open. Paul, fantastic to catch up with you, mate. Always a particular pleasure talking rugby, but all the big sports news. And before I let you go, I've got to get a tip for this weekend. How do you see it playing out?
Look, I think the All Blacks will win. I don't think it will be a blowout, but I think their desperation will get them home. But this Wallabies team is going to keep coming.
Yeah, the blowtorch on Ian Foster, if the All Blacks weren't to win, would be absolutely huge. Paul Cully from stuff.co.nz, thank you so much for being on the best on ground weekday kickoff. Thanks to Christy Dora, Natalie Ioannidis, Brad Walter as well for being on the show this week. And of course, Courtney Walsh from The Australian. Massive weekend of sport, NRL finals, AFL finals, Bledisloe Cup. Look forward to dissecting it all on Monday with Christy Dora. Have yourselves a great weekend. Cheers.